Good morning, everyone, and welcome to How Do We Keep Partisan Politics Out of Election Administration? I'm Trevor Potter, president and founder of Campaign Legal Center. Thank you for joining us. CLC is a national nonpartisan organization that works to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process. We believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. Today, we have a panel of policy experts and election administration officials who will discuss solutions that can be used to improve election administration processes and leave partisan politics out. After Election Day, the election administration officials use a variety of procedures like reviews and audits while counting ballots and certifying the outcome of elections. These procedures are designed to ensure that election outcomes are fair and accurate. At CLC, we are working to help everyone learn more about and understand the processes in place that protect the integrity of our elections and how legal policy and administrative solutions can be used to support election officials as they do their jobs to ensure that our elections reflect the will of the American people. Now, I would like to turn this over to our moderator for today, CLC's Caleb Jackson, who is Legal Counsel Voting Rights at CLC, to introduce the members of today's panel. Caleb?
Thank you, Trevor. Before I introduce our panel, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. During the conversation, please use the comment section on Facebook or YouTube to submit your questions for members of the panel. At the end of the panel, we will start the question and answer section, and we will do our best to get to each question. But in the interest of time, we may not be able to answer each and every one of them. If we are not able to answer your question today and you are a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. If you are a member of the public and we're not able to get to your question today, please email info@campaignlegal.org. Now, I would like to introduce today's panel. First, we have Jonathan Diaz, who's Senior Legal Counsel for Voting Rights here at CLC, where he focuses on increasing access to the ballot and lowering burdens on voting for all Americans. He has served as counsel for plaintiffs in numerous voting cases here at CLC. Next, we have Tammy Patrick, who works as Senior Advisor to the Elections Program at the Democracy Fund. She served as the Federal Compliance Officer for Arapahoe County Elections Department for 11 years, where she established herself as a collaborative partner for those seeking to improve the American voting experience. And finally, we have Peg Perl, the Director of Elections for Arapahoe County, Colorado, who helped design and enact Colorado's modern voting laws while serving as Senior Counsel for the nonpartisan Colorado Ethics Watch and principal of her own policy and democracy education firm. Thank you to the members of our panel for joining us today for what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. And let's jump right in. So Tammy, I'll start with you. The first question is, how does one become an election administration official? Are people elected? Are people appointed? Or is it a position anyone can find on a job site and submit a resume for?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. You know, the answer in elections is always yes and, or there are instances of, or it may be true that. So all of the above is the answer that's correct here. But with all kidding aside, I often say that there are very few who wake up as children and say, I want to grow up to be an election official. And that's actually a little too bad because it's such an amazing position and profession to go into. We know that more than half of election officials in this country are in fact elected to those positions. The vast majority of those elected offices are in rural and smaller jurisdictions, and they are most often partisan elected positions that are taken. The remaining portion of election officials are either appointed, oftentimes by a state governing body or a secretary of state, and oftentimes those two are partisan appointments. And then we have a smaller fraction that are the public servants that are hired to do the job and are accountable just to those who hired them and to the voters, but not at the ballot box.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Peg, I'd like to go to you next. What role do election officials play in the post-election process?
Thanks, Caleb, and thanks everybody for having me here with Tammy and all of you. So election officials, there's a couple levels of elections officials who are involved post-election, and it depends on what state you're in a little bit here. But for example, here in Colorado, we have a Secretary of State's office who has certain roles when it comes to certifying election results or helping run our statewide risk limiting audit after the election here. And then we have our county clerks here in Colorado. So 64 counties each have an elected county clerk who is the main election official for that county. And then they work with their civil service staff like myself to carry out everything that we're doing. So when it comes to counting the ballots, receiving the ballots, that is done at the county level here in Colorado. And so all of that work with the days following the election. Here we have a 10-day cure period. We're receiving ballots from overseas, things like that. That's all done at the county level. And then the risk limiting audit is something we do in cooperation with our state officials at the end of that 10-day period. And then the certification of our election, we work with our county level canvass boards first, and then again, turn that materials over to the Secretary of State's office. So it is a multi-week process. I love the people who email me the day after Wednesday morning and say, now that the election is over, don't you feel better? And I always say, well, talk to me at Thanksgiving, at least. We're still working on it. And it's multiple levels of people involved, both elected and, like I said, civil service folks who are working still.
Thanks, Peg. And Jonathan, I want to go to you next. Now that we've learned a little bit more about the role of election administration officials, can you tell us a little bit about some of the rules that govern post-election reviews, audits, and procedures?
Sure. Well, I think as Tammy and Peg both alluded to, the answer with almost everything in elections is that it depends. Different states have different rules and procedures that they follow because they have different election systems. A state like Colorado that has really high rates of mail voting is going to be very different from a state like Texas, which has mostly in-person voting. But the constants that we see kind of across states in these post-election reviews and audits, at least the way that they're supposed to run, are they follow very detailed procedures. They are conducted by election administration professionals who understand how to handle ballots, how to tabulate them, how to work with voting machines in a way that preserves the integrity of those machines, and they are conducted in a method that is transparent. What is, I think, most important about these post-election procedures, audits, reviews, recounts, are the role that they play in increasing or ensuring confidence in our elections, in showing the public that the proper procedures were followed, that ballots were properly handled and counted. And that can only happen if there is a sufficient degree of transparency. So when a state is conducting something like a risk limiting audit in Colorado or in Michigan, having a clear, publicly available set of procedures beforehand that election officials are going to follow, conducting those procedures in public in a way that can be observed, so that the best, it's an old cliche, but the best disinfectant is sunlight, and having that transparency is a hugely necessary part of that post-election process. And unfortunately, what we have seen in the last year are a number of jurisdictions doing it the wrong way. Cutting election administrators out of the process, having privately appointed reviewers under the supervision of legislators, reviewing ballots with unclear standards, not handling election machines in the right way, and doing it, conducting these, what they call audits, but which are really, just kind of sham after the fact reviews, in a way that only increases uncertainty and promotes, false narratives about how elections were run. And so when we're in the post-election period, it's especially important that all of these processes are conducted openly and transparently and according to the pre-established procedures.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Tammy and Peg, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I'll jump in real quickly there. Jonathan is absolutely right. There are certain criteria that I think the public and that voters not only should demand, but deserve when we talk about how elections are conducted, as well as how they are reviewed and audited and what policies and procedures are in place. And not only do we need those actions to be transparent, but they do absolutely need to be established well in advance of knowing what the outcome of an election could potentially be. So if you think about going into, playing a football game or a basketball game or a board game without any of the rules defined, or at the end of the game, you decide, you know what, I want to change some of these rules and revise how we played the game. That's not how it should work. We do know that there are very standard basic protocols around transparency, chain of custody, observability. So an open, observable process for both the public as well as those who have a vested interest in the outcome. So making sure that candidates, parties, proponents for or against a particular initiative or proposition, that they all have the ability to observe the process. And if something arises that causes them concern, that they do have legal channels to exhaust, to state their case and to make those considerations or claims heard in court. And then after that is all settled and done, that there is a finality to the process. And that is normally the certification of the election itself. So all of these things need to be laid forth well in advance. And we do have a number of very set agreed upon rules of engagement for these types of audits and post-election procedures and policies. At Democracy Fund, we were fortunate enough for a number of years to support the work of Jennifer Morrell in a Knowing It's Right series, where we look at things like risk limiting audits, as well as other post-election reviews. In Arizona, when I was the federal compliance officer, we did hand counting of ballots. We had reconciliation audits. There was the tabulation centers have been viewable 24/7 in all 15 counties in Arizona for more than a decade. So there's transparency that's there, and it's important that voters and the public understand what those are well in advance of the process.
Yeah, and
Peg,
I'll just follow up on what Tammy said with an example. So I think that transparency is important, and it's also important to make sure that we're doing the work before the election. As election administrators, to do some voter education so people know what it is they're watching when it comes to the post-election process. So for us here in Arapahoe County, it was important this year before the election to put out 2 short little videos explaining basically our pre-election testing of the voting equipment. What is it, in like a 2-minute video with some graphics and things, and then also what is a risk limiting audit. Again, a brief little 2-minute video. What even is it? Discussing in both of those things like the fact that bipartisan teams are involved in the process, these rules that Tammy's talking about that make the process a good one for testing before the election or checking as an audit afterwards. We put those kind of how-to videos or info videos out first, and then when it actually came time to do those steps in this fall, we just had an election, statewide election in November 2021, we then put on Facebook Live the entire real live logic and accuracy testing. And then same thing, risk limiting audit. We can put that on Facebook Live with some narration of what you're seeing. But giving that primer first to lay out those rules and some graphics and things so that people can maybe understand what it is, and then showing it in action. It's kind of a multi-layer approach so that people hopefully understand what they're seeing.
Thank you so much. And Tammy, I just want to go back to you for this next question. As voters, most of us want election results as fast as possible, but we also want them to be accurate. In your experience, how can election administration officials balance the public's expectation to have the results quickly with the time that's required to certify the results?
So there's an old adage that election officials often use, and that is that elections cheap, accurate, or fast, but you only get to pick two. So you picked two of them, which means that they're not going to be fast. Well, if you want them fast and accurate, they're not going to be cheap. And we know that there's insufficient funding of our elections. There's been studies that have been done around the percentage of a county budget that is allocated to the elections office. And that study found that in the counties that they reviewed, less than 0.5% of the county's budgets were actually allocated to the elections department. So if you doubled the elections budget, you'd have 1% of the county's budget. And unfortunately, that's systemic around the country. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that if the expectation is that we have a pretty comprehensive review of or total of votes cast in the day or two after election day, then we need to align our rules, our regulations, our statutory dates and deadlines so that election officials can do some of the work before election day. Because we know that when voters are given options in voting, like voting by mail or voting at home or voting early in-person absentee or voting in person early. We all use different terms and phrases across the country for what we mean by voting other than election day. If we want to have those options, we need to make sure then that voters are placing those ballots early on in the period, mailing their ballots back early on in the election period. Because when that happens and the election officials are allowed to process those early cast ballots, not to create totals, not to declare any winners, but to start the process of verifying the authenticity of the ballot and of the voter, when that can occur before election day, the truth is that on election night for states like Colorado, Arizona, many of these states with high volumes of early voting, that first flush of numbers that come pouring in on election night are traditionally vote by mail and absentee ballots. The reason is for those states, mostly out west, they're able to start processing as soon as the ballots are returned. And because of that, they're able to total everything up as soon as the polls close and get those results ready to release. Now, we know in some states, that is not the case. So we don't have to look far back in 2020 to know that a state like Michigan, Michigan and a few other states, they have to wait until election day to start processing any of those early ballots. And what that means is that on election day, they then have to start authenticating the voter, determining eligibility. If you think about when you open your mail, you go to the mailbox, you open it up, and you open up your envelope, you take it out. Now imagine if that envelope contained a ballot, how careful you would be. Now imagine that you're opening up thousands of those envelopes. In the case of Maricopa, we had over 2 million registered voters and about 2 million of them voted by mail. So imagine opening up 2 million ballots. It takes time. So we need to make sure that our policies align so that election officials have the time to do the job, the time to do it well and diligently, and we can still meet those voters' expectations. Now, with that said, there isn't a state in the nation that has had an official declaration of winner by an election official the day of or the day after election day in decades, if not ever, because there are always ballots that are still coming in. Not that they were cast before the polls were closed, or that they were cast after the polls were closed, but that they're received after the polls are closed. And what I mean by that are military and overseas voters stationed around the globe, provisional ballots that need to be reviewed, vote by mail ballots in states where the voter had to put them in the mail stream and the Postal Service postmark them to make sure that they were placed and cast before the polls closed, but that still means that that voter should have that ballot count. And I often convey the notion of, if you're watching basketball, sorry for all the sports analogies, but if you're watching basketball and that the shot clock is about to go off and the shot leaves the player's hand and there's still time on the clock, if they get their ballot cast and mailed or dropped off before the close of the polls, it should count, the basket should count, the vote should count. but sometimes it takes a while to review it. And that's what we're waiting for after Election Day.
I love the buzzer beater analogy, Tammy. And Peg, I want to go to you next. What do you see as the biggest challenge election administration officials will face in 2022? And, I'll give everybody a chance to answer this question, but we want to start with you, Peg.
So I think one of the biggest challenges in 2022 for election administrators is the need to continue to do the work of 2022 while at the same time battling misinformation or just continued questions about maybe lingering from 2020 coming in, or from past information from another state maybe. I know here in Colorado, we have spent a lot of time over the last year and a half answering questions from our local residents about things that happen in other states. They heard on the news something about a different state, and then there are residents, so they want to call here and talk to us. And we always want to talk to our residents, and we can only do so much to talk about what our process is versus what another state is. So I think where there is at times a beauty in allowing local jurisdictions and states to have differences in how they administer elections to match the communities that they live in and the communities that they serve. I think that inconsistency is unfortunately becoming more problematic for everybody in their own hometown because it can raise questions. There's a little more of just distrust at times if things are done differently. So I think it's proactively doing the work and explaining the work that you're doing here without necessarily trying to counteract things that might be done perfectly well in another place as well. They're just done differently, and that's okay. It does not mean we all have to do it exactly the same for it to be correct. There is more than one way to do things. We talk with election officials from all over the country, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do things and still meet these standards we're talking about that are great. But I think what we do want to do is make sure that our voters, wherever you're working as a local administrator, have the confidence in their votes counting, that their votes are going through the process fairly, and that they can understand what is happening in the whole process going through for themselves, and to maybe be able to say to a neighbor or a friend who is themselves unsure, and they want to be able to explain amongst themselves as trusted messengers why they have faith in the election system to their friends. So demystifying some of these technical terms and things like that so that people can share it amongst themselves, I think is really important as well.
Thank you so much, Peg. And Tammy and Jonathan, do you want to add something?
Sure. Yeah, I can go next. I think one of the new obstacles that we're seeing or going to see in 2022 that we haven't seen in past elections are changes in the law from state legislatures that actively make election administration officials' jobs harder. Prohibitions like the one passed in Ohio that prevent election administrators from working with non-government groups on things like voter education and voter registration. Bans on accepting donations and private funds from nonprofit foundations and things like that. As Tammy mentioned, a lot of election offices are grossly underfunded and under-resourced, and in 2020, especially reacting to the pandemic, really relied on some of those charitable donations to be able to keep their volunteers safe and make sure that our elections could run. And now a number of states have moved to block that kind of non-government funding without also adding state funding to elections. There have been a number of states that have imposed new criminal penalties on election administrators for things like sending absentee ballots to registered voters. So, rather than helping their local officials do their jobs, to give them the resources to fight misinformation and to efficiently count ballots and do all the many things that we've been talking about that they need to do in the post-election period, state lawmakers are really throwing up even more roadblocks and obstacles in this post-election period that are not going to make elections safer, that are not going to make election administrators' jobs easier. They're just going to increase uncertainty and make this process take longer. They're not taking the steps that, that Tammy mentioned about making sure that election administrators can process mail ballots as they arrive instead of waiting until election day. So I really, and all of these policies and these laws that are being passed that are only making things more restrictive, not just on voters, but on administrators and volunteers, they're not really serving any legitimate government purpose. They're just fueled by these kind of conspiracy theories and the misinformation about the 2020 election and how it was or wasn't run. And I think that they're only going to make those problems worse. So, that's going to be a real hurdle for not just election administrators, but for the media, for groups like CLC, for voters to be able to understand, what the post-election process is supposed to be like, and to work with local election officials to make sure that voters actually have the opportunity to cast their ballots and make sure those ballots are counted.
And I would say there's another facet of this that's going to be a challenge in this year and the coming years. At Democracy Fund, we've done a partnership for the last few years with Reed College, doing a survey of local election officials. And some of the information data points that we came across are kind of interesting, if not troubling. And that is 74% of the chief local election officials in this country are over the age of 50. A quarter of them are over the age of 65. 35% of them, so more than a third, are eligible to retire before the 2024 election. And more than half of those are in our largest jurisdictions all across the country. And what I mean by that is that they're more than 250,000 registered voters. So we know that our election official profession and the cohort of individuals who are running our elections are at a point in their professional careers where they can start to leave the field. And what that always means, because you always have, individuals retiring and moving into other positions, is that you have that loss of institutional knowledge and expertise. But in this moment, we're also finding that because of the challenging work environment that the chief election officials are facing, as well as all of their staff and poll workers, one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in the ensuing years is to attract young or middle-aged or old talent, just talent in general, to help us ensure that we have a healthy and a safe democracy for our voters. We need to make sure that young people in college know that election administration is a really interesting profession, and bring them into the fold. Because without individuals there to conduct our elections, we will not have a democracy. You have to have people who are going to do the work. And it's long hours. Peg will tell you, we used to joke that we would hope we would be done by Thanksgiving. And sometimes we weren't, because there was just too much work to be done. And that's not working 9 to 5, I will say. That's, putting in 15, 16, 17, 18-hour days or more for months on end. I'm not really positioning this job description very well for people, right? So I better pull back on that piece. But I will say that it is one of the most fulfilling roles anyone can do. And you can do it in a variety of ways. So sign up to be a poll worker, and that helps fill some of the gaps that we're seeing. If you're looking for a position, even if it's a temporary position, thousands of temporary workers are hired every election, local elections, state elections, federal elections in this country. And without that, that enthusiasm for pitching in and making sure that it is a well-run and a legitimately conducted election, without that enthusiasm, we will have some real trouble ahead. And I think that many people that I've spoken to in state and election offices are concerned about the targets that have been placed on them, on their offices, and their ability to still attract that talent that they need to do this work. And so I think we need to make sure that in the public square, that we're dialing back this rhetoric, that we're talking about the truth, that we're talking about facts, that we're talking about science, that we're negating this this rhetoric that inflames and conflates what is real with what someone wishes happened in the most recent election, whichever election that may be, because that's the thing with elections. You always have people who win and you always have people who lose. And those who lose never believe or rarely believe the legitimacy of the election. And it doesn't matter what letter is after your name or if you don't have a letter after your name. So I think that's one of the things that we need to all be really concerned about, is making sure that everyone stays engaged, not just in the role of voter, but also in additional capacities if you have the time. Be an auditor, help out with the risk limiting audit. There's my pitch for you, Peg.
Thanks. And Caleb, if I could just jump on something Tammy just said there, bringing us back to kind of the title you guys have added to this event for keeping partisanship out of election administration. You know, there's many states like Colorado where all of our process that we need to do around an election with the election judges that we hire temporarily to work need to be done basically in bipartisan pairs. So we need to have enough people from our whole community, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, Green Party, Libertarian Party. We need folks from all over who can step up and help and also have some faith and integrity in the system to be able to make the system work. So we need to continue to have that outreach and, like I said, faith across party lines completely, because that is part of how our election administration stays nonpartisan and fair and accurate for everybody, because every step in the counting process, picking up ballots, everything we do, the auditing, the testing, is all done in these pairs so that you do not have one political party in charge of any step. And that builds in the actual facts of the trust or of the fairness in the process and helps build trust. So we do need people from all across the community to participate to make it work.
If I could just jump in on one more thing on that, because Peg and I could go back and forth all day because she's just so inspiring. The other piece that I think is really critical for the public to know is we all talk about the balance of powers in the United States, and whether it's the three branches of government, or it's Peg's example of the bipartisan teams that go out and pick up ballots, to the checks and balances on the certification of election results between the local election official and then their board of supervisors, their county commissioners, to the secretary of state or the state board. There are levels of checks and balances all throughout the system to make sure that if there is an error or if there is something that is truly malfeasance and criminal activities, that there is oversight and remedy for that. That is nothing new. That is just the basic function of our democracy. And so I think it's important for people to remember that in this moment, that we do have legal channels, we do have auditing, we do have collaboration of observers watching for both voter suppression and voter fraud. So when we step back from the rhetoric and we look at how our system is actually constructed, I think that the more people understand their own elections in their communities and in their state, the more they should be comfortable with the integrity of that system and the legitimacy of it. And we know that from research that that's the case, right? People are always confident in what's happening locally, or mostly confident what's happening locally. It's those people over there in the other states that they're concerned about. And that's where we just have to realize that just because, as Peg mentioned, just because something is done a little differently, it doesn't mean that it has less legitimacy.
Thank you so much, Tammy and Peg, for those super helpful answers. And Jonathan, I just want to toss it back to you before we begin taking questions from the audience. What are some policy solutions that we can implement around the country to help address some of the challenges election administration officials will face in these upcoming elections that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, it's a big question because, as we said up top, we don't really have one national election system in this country. We have thousands because every state has different election laws and every county has, different ways of doing things, within those state laws. And so it's going to necessarily depend on where you're at and what the state of the election code is in your particular jurisdiction But some general things that, everyone can do kind of across the country are policies that we should enact. Some of them we've already mentioned, things like allowing for the pre-processing of mail-in early vote ballots to make that counting process. The counting doesn't begin until after Election Day, but if the identification envelopes and the ballot verification, if all of those steps can start to take place as the ballots arrive instead of waiting for them to pile up and beginning when polls close, that's going to make the whole system more efficient. It's going to make results come more quickly. It's going to make results more accurate because election officials like Peg will have less to do in that post-election day period because they can get some of that work done early. Tammy mentioned the importance of observers to the process and having members from both political parties, non-affiliated and independent voters as well, observing the process. That is true, and that is a key piece of some of the transparency that we've talked about. But we also need to make sure that those observers have clear rules and guidelines that they can follow to make sure that they are not harassing or threatening election workers as they do this important work. Some of the brain drain that we talked about of, veteran long-term election officials and volunteers leaving the field is because of harassment and threats that are fueled and motivated by the lies and conspiracies surrounding the 2020 election. And so we want to make sure that those folks are protected because no one's going to want to do the very important and sometimes difficult work of administering and certifying our elections if they don't feel safe. So extending the protections that we already have under state and federal law for polling places to protect voters, making sure that those protections also cover election workers involved in the very important business of counting and certifying our votes. And making sure that all of these processes, from ballot handling and tabulation to recounts and audits, making sure that these processes are sufficiently detailed in state law so that election officials and the public know what their duties are, what they're required to do, and what discretion they have to respond to developing circumstances. One area of law where this was hugely important in 2020 was in emergency authorities. There are some states that have really robust and well-defined emergency procedures. When something unforeseen happens and you have to adapt, you have to move a polling place, you have to allow mail voting, things like that. My home state of Florida, election season overlaps with hurricane season. So Florida has really, really detailed election procedures. Who has what authority and when when does the governor step in? When is the Secretary of State involved? When is it a county decision? Not every state has that. And so making sure that we have these procedures set as far in advance as possible and that they're as detailed as possible so that there's a playbook for the post-election period that not only election administrators can use, but that the public can look at and say, this is what's supposed to happen. These are the rules that they are following. And this is the bipartisan team that is observing it. And all of those things, the more detail that we have in these procedures and the more we can make the public and the media aware of them, it's a lot harder for misinformation to take root if good information gets there first. And so the more that we can educate the public and the more that we can provide administrators with the resources and the guidelines that they can follow in that post-election process, the better off we'll be.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. And I don't know, Tammy and Peg, if you have anything else you want to add before we go to the audience for questions.
Well, people who know me working in this space for years and years know I always have a policy to-do list somewhere on my computer. I need one of those old cartoon scrolls for how long it is. So I won't go into all of that detail, but I think Jonathan hit most of the main things. I think there is a balance between some national expectations and floors versus then tailoring some individual things for each state. And I think that's really important balance to strike, which is why you don't see national legislation about election administration happen all that often, because that's a really tough balance to strike. And so I know that that's something that sometimes happens unofficially when you do have what Jonathan has probably seen by looking at the statutes, some vagueness in state law that maybe gives a lot of discretion to county officials. I can at least say, and Tammy knows this from her experience as well, a lot of the county and state level officials are all talking to each other through various professional associations and adopting best practices where allowed, even where not mandated. So that's at least still happening and going on, and I continue to see that going on. I would like to see them all get more funding to be able to help that, though.
And I would add to that that one of the challenges that I would posit for the viewers or for the watchers / listeners today is when you hear of these policy changes, think to yourself, one, what is the reason for it? Is it based on fact? Is it based on the truth, or is it based basically on conjecture and conspiracy theory and what someone is positing or how someone feels about someone or someone's opinion? So what is the reason behind it? And then ask yourself, who benefits from this? Does it benefit voters in general? And if so, how do you feel about that? And if not benefiting the voter, if it's not improving the voter's experience, if it's not improving the functioning of the government to service the voters, then what is the real cause here? Who does it serve and to what end? And then the last piece is, and is it being funded? Because oftentimes some of these mandates come down and there's no support for the implementation of it. And also the timing of it can be a real challenge. So if the timing of the new law or the new policy coincides with voters having already started voting or candidates having already started campaigning and circulating petitions for nomination and that sort of thing, the timing of elections is always tantamount, because election day is set in law in most places, or once it's declared, it's set in stone. Kind of, maybe, sort of, with that, everything's got this asterisk next to it, especially since we talked about emergency declarations. But I think we really need to start thinking critically about what the changes are that are being advocated, and realize that we can have nonpartisan, bipartisan, laws and policies passed. Look at Kentucky. I mean, my heart goes out for all my friends in Kentucky and with everything that they're dealing with right now. But before the 2020 election, voters in Kentucky didn't have a lot of options in when and where to vote, and they made some real changes in response to COVID. And after the 2020 election, they sat back and they said, let's look at those changes we made. Did they help voters? Were they beneficial? How did that play out? And then they passed statutory abilities to codify those changes because they did benefit their voters. Unfortunately, in many places, what we're seeing is a rolling back, not only of those advances that were made last year in providing voters with more options to participate, but in some cases, they're scaling it back to before time, rules of engagement, in some cases, moving back decades and restricting voters' abilities to participate in the franchise in specific ways. So the last thing I'll say to that is, as a voter, when you participate in your state and local elections in the next year or this year, think about what options you had available to you. And if you feel that those options were limited or did not align with what you wanted as a voter, make sure you know how those policies were determined, who made the determinations, and then see if they're on the ballot in the next election and make your voices heard.
And the one thing that I'll add is that Kentucky process that Tammy described was, I think, the only instance in the last year of a bipartisan lawmaking process on elections. It is possible, that Kentucky has a Democratic governor and a Republican Secretary of State and a Republican legislature, and they came together to make positive changes that worked for voters. And there were other opportunities for that to happen in this past year's legislative cycles. We saw a number of, letters and positions expressed by election officials on a bipartisan basis. Some of those statewide associations that Peg mentioned, in Florida, in Ohio, in Arizona, the people who actually do this work, who run our elections at the county level, coming together across partisan lines. Some of them were elected as Democrats, some of them were elected as Republicans, saying, we need help, we need these changes, or this proposal from the legislature won't work. It will make our jobs harder. And unfortunately, in most states, they were ignored. So to that list that Tammy gave of what you should be looking for as a voter, as a constituent, look to your local election officials. If they are all coming together across party lines to say, this is a good idea, we need it, or this is a bad idea, don't do it, see how the legislature responds to that, because chances are the folks running the elections, your county election supervisor or board of elections chair or county clerk or whatever it's called in your state, you know, they are the ones who understand best how this process works most often. And, you know, it's unfortunate that legislators seem to be paying them less and less attention as this issue gets more nationally polarized.
And I would say, just, I know we keep adding one more thing on. I think that part of the other challenge here is that legislators will say that they are doing these things in response to all the calls they're hearing from their constituents who don't have confidence in the system as it currently stands. And the question that we need to be asking of those legislators is, and are you correcting them with the truth when they posit these questions or these you know, conspiracy theories around the 2020 election, or the reason why they lack confidence? Do you ask them why they lack confidence? Do you ask them and provide them with the truth and the facts of the matter that the 2020 election, you know, as Chris Krebs says, was the most transparent, but I will say, or the most secure, but I will go on to say it's the most transparent, the most audited, the most litigated, the most observed election with more paper ballots voted by more people in US history. So we need to make sure that we're responding to our constituents with facts and the truth, and basing our policies on those bedrock or bedrocks, as opposed to using it as a way to launch and further mis and disinformation for partisan gain.
Thank you so much for that. And now I want to go to the audience. The first question we have from Naomi: is there a good model of a state that has removed partisanship from the election certification process in particular?
Well, I'll put a pitch in for how Colorado does it. I think Colorado, you know, we have a pretty good balance. The way we handle certification of our elections is each county, we have a county canvass board. And those canvass board members, there's an equal number of members appointed by the county Republican Party and the county Democratic Party, and then the county clerk, who is elected from some party or could be unaffiliated. In Colorado, some of our county clerks are unaffiliated. They make up the county canvass board. Those folks are required to participate, for example, in to be at one round of the risk limiting audit and to be involved in the auditing process before you get to kind of the official canvass board meeting. There's a very laid out process in election law and statute of exactly what that canvass board meeting goes over, what types of reconciling of ballots cast versus ballots received, what data they look at, what information they review, what documents they review to certify the election. And then there's rules, again, in statute and law about it's a majority vote of the canvass board to sign off on the election, and then how that works. And then there's even processes in law, if need be, if that majority isn't reached, what happens next and how that goes back up to the state level. But then that basically is certifying it for that county, and it doesn't run through legislators or any other partisan board of or elected officials or anything from there, but in Colorado.
Thank you so much, Peg.
Yeah, I think that's pretty standard, that some of the states that have, and I know Peg and I have talked about this, about the increase of unaffiliated voters or independent voters that don't align with, you know, the two major parties, that many states have had to change their statutes so that you don't have a board of a single party position or a single party affiliation, so that there's a mixed composition of poll workers between Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Green Party, Libertarians. What we really want is to make sure that there isn't a monolithic voice that's the one who has the authority to certify or decertify a certain element, so that you have that bipartisan or multi-partisan, nonpartisan type of an effort. And then that goes from both the county level to the state level, and even at many of the state levels, you'll have a Secretary of State and an AG and a governor that all have to sign the certification of it in the final process. And so there can be, of course, those may be the same political party, but more often than not, they'll have some sort of a mixture there.
Thanks, Tim. And I guess for our next question, do any jurisdictions impose ethical rules on election administrators? If so, do those rules regulate partisan activity, similar to codes of ethics for judges? And Jonathan, I'll let you go ahead and answer this one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know that a lot of jurisdictions have ethical rules that apply kind of across the board to civil servants and, state or county employees that govern things like accepting gifts and, those, similar to the way that there are limitations on, members of Congress and things like that. I don't know offhand whether they would regulate partisan activity. I think that it has generally been more of a norm among election administrators to, even those who, even those who are elected as partisan candidates to office, typically in the past have once they've been elected and taken office, have administered elections in a generally nonpartisan manner and tend to have disassociated from their state or county party organizations. They are often especially at the statewide level. I'm getting notes from Peg and Tammy that they are precluded from making endorsements in races that they're overseeing. That they can't get into. They can't be heavily involved with their state or county parties. But that's not always the case. We often see, especially secretaries of state, run for higher office as partisan candidates in in a governor's race or a Senate race or whatever it might be, in an election that they are responsible for overseeing. And in some cases they recuse themselves, and in other cases they're not required to. And so I think that this is an area where the law could use some work. I'm sure that there are plenty of states that could develop stricter ethics codes with restrictions on partisan activity for election administrators. And it's definitely something that I know our ethics team is looking into and working on.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Peg and Tammy, did you all want to weigh in on that one as well?
I cheated. They gave me their answers.
So I guess we'll just go to our last question here. Many states prohibit unaffiliated and third-party voters from participating in large aspects of election administration. How do you see that affecting the level of partisanship? And whoever wants to take this one, feel free.
I mean, I can start. I think it's huge, especially as we see in a lot of states. In Colorado, in Florida, the number of non-affiliated or independent voters continues to grow. That's a major part of the electorate. And in some states, the election codes, especially related to observers or county boards, certification boards, or canvassing boards in some states, mandate an even split between Republicans and Democrats. And that is necessarily keeping a huge slice of the electorate who maybe because they are unaffiliated or because they're not part of one of the two major parties are less inclined or less susceptible to that kind of partisan motivation or push. And so, I think that rather than mandating an equal number of members on a board or an equal number of observers of the two major parties, states could restructure these rules to, say, there can't be a majority of one party, which would allow for a mix of, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, minor party voters. I say minor just in terms of size, not that they're any less important. But I don't know, Peg, if you want to jump in and talk about your experience in Colorado.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Arapahoe County, Colorado, unaffiliated voters is actually our largest block. They are number one within the two major parties of Democratic and Republican parties being number 2 and number 3. We have well over 42-ish% is unaffiliated voters in our county. So we also in Colorado over the last few cycles have adopted the ability for unaffiliated voters to participate in primaries. They basically just have to choose whether they're voting the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot. You can't vote in both and bounce back and forth, but you can choose to participate if you'd like in those partisan primaries. So those types of things are starting to open up just because of the number of folks, and it was passed by popular referendum as well. So we have that option in Colorado. But you know, you're right that all of the other steps along the way don't necessarily explicitly include that. We include unaffiliated voters or Libertarian Green Party type voters as election judges to fill out bipartisan pairs, basically only as filler if our major party lists don't give us enough people to do all the jobs we need to do. So they get the priority under state law, and we can use the other people in to kind of fill some gaps only. So I do think that it would be useful to kind of be able to bring that in a little more. I think when you're putting your policy wonk hat on, though, when you're at the state legislature and you're going to change your state law, you'll have somebody who is a point person for the major parties there talking to legislators about the position of their party and what they do and don't want in law. And unaffiliated voters don't necessarily have a lobbyist, so to speak, who represents them as a group, so to speak. So it's a more interesting policy puzzle to put together. But I think some of the states who have unaffiliated or third-party voters participating more, I think are slowly going to bring that into the administration side as well, just as a natural outgrowth of the participation and registration rates. It's got to happen for representative democracy. That's what it's about.
Thank you, Peg. And I just want to say thank you to Peg, Tammy, and Jonathan, our speakers, and all of our guests for joining us today. As we prepare for the 2022 midterms and the 2024 presidential election, it's important that we all work to ensure that election administration officials have the support, resources, and tools to do their job without partisan interference. Our democracy works best when all Americans can participate freely and safely. We have a duty as Americans to ensure that every vote is counted and that we accept those results, no matter which way they go. If you have any additional questions or would like more information, please email us at info@campaignlegalcenter.org. And I just want to thank everyone again and hope that all of you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks, everyone.
you.